The dawn over King's Landing began as a pale seam where the glittering belly of Blackwater Bay pressed against the sky. The city stirred slowly, groaning awake like something vast and old finding its joints. Roof tiles warmed by the first light clinked as if in conversation. Gulls scolded the ships, and smoke climbed the morning like a patient prayer. The Red Keep watched it all with the impassive calm of old stone, its angles gathering light and shadow until even those became obedient. Inside, the king lay awake. He had woken before the gulls. He listened to the whispering drift of servants in the corridor, to a guard's cough, to the faint clatter of a bucket's iron handle somewhere far below. He knew the language of keeps, the way stone carried sound, the way a thick door turned the world to murmurs. He had learned those things long ago, before the weight of the crown had given him the slow ache behind the eyes that never quite left. Robert stared at the canopy over his bed and counted the breaths it took for the ache to recede. Pine resin and the sour ghost of wine hung in the air. The chain of a maester's lamp ticked as it cooled. He could taste blood still, metallic and thin at the back of his throat. He could smell the old boar that had almost taken him, a memory stink of mud and bristles and something that was not fear but close, the feeling of losing one's balance over a drop. He had fallen, then clambered up again, and done what he always had done. Laughed. It had rattled even him. How the laugh had come, rude, big as a drum, drowning out the worried sounds of squires and hounds. It had not tasted like victory. It had tasted like iron and age. When he turned his head, the pillow smelled of the sea, though he knew that was foolish. He had not seen the sea this close in too long. There had been nothing close in too long, not wine, not the scarlet radiance of a feast, not the splendid blaze of banners in a tournament field. Everything had been distant the way you remember, and he was tired of remembering. A knock came then, a small, respectful rhythm that would never have been dared when he was younger, when he'd have roared for men to enter and they'd have stumbled in with their helmets under their arms and their tongues swollen with apologies for interrupting. He found the smallness of the knock annoyed him. He sat up with care. His whole middle protested. The long scrape of a tusk across flesh, the subsequent stitch upon stitch to keep the blood inside its walls. They had bound him up like a capstan rope, and he resented the neatness of their knots. "Enter," he said, came out thick. The door opened and Eddard Stark came in on the cane he kept pretending he did not need. There was a stiffness to the way Ned moved, a winter in his bones that Robert had not caused but had worsened. Jaime Lannister's little fury in the street had done the rest of it. Robert knew all that and did not look too closely at it because when he looked too closely at it, there were too many things it touched. Ned bowed in that quiet northern way of his that made bowing seem a courtesy to the ground, not to the king. He lifted his head and for a moment, nothing moved between them except the dust in the first slant of morning. The king gestured and Ned came to the chair by the bed and sank into it, putting the cane aside. His mouth had the look of a man who had rehearsed words and then decided not to use them. "You're up early?" Robert said, and finally, because it had nagged him since he woke, "Is it early? I feel it." "It is," Ned said. "The city is quiet at this hour, or as quiet as it gets." "Hounds," Robert muttered. "Boars and hounds and clumsy boys with wine." He flexed his hands, the fingers ground with old work. "I remember the way the tusk came. It had patience, Ned. It stepped through the brush and sunk toward me like a ship coming into berth. Not rushing. It knew where it meant to be." Ned's eyes were steady. "You're here. That is what matters." Robert grunted. "They've stitched me like a sail. They've stitched you like a king who refuses to stay down," Ned said, the dry humor warming his voice for half a breath. Sometimes, in the quiet, Robert could find the shape of the boy he'd been around Ned. Mud on the boots and stolen apples in the pockets and a laugh that came without being asked to. He tried to find it now and found only the wicker rattle of age. "Speak," he said abruptly. "I know you have something put away behind your teeth. Best we get to it, for both our sakes. I've no patience for games this morning." Ned's jaw shifted once as he said it. He looked to the door, then back at the king. "We'll need it closed." Robert frowned, but he waved. The guard outside put his head in, then shut the heavy door with a soft clap. "Pycelle can wait," Robert said. "Varys can wait. The rest can stew in their own juices. Tell me." Ned leaned forward, the knuckles of his hands whitening where they rested on his knee. He spoke with the care of a man laying stones for a bridge where the river below chafes at the banks. "I came by the truth not because I was clever," he began, "but because the truth was patient and waited exactly where it had been all along, in a book of names and in the open faces of children. I did not want the truth, but we do not always have the leisure to choose what we want." Robert watched him. He smelled pine again. It was only the lamp. "Your children," Ned said, and in those two words Robert felt something old in him brace, as if expecting a blow and refusing to duck. "Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, my children," Robert echoed flat. It lay between them like a shield. "They are not yours," Ned said. There was no noise. The city below breathed and the gulls knocked against the air with their wings, and in the bedchamber the two men were very still, as if any sudden movement would tip the world off the edge of itself. Robert was surprised at himself. Yeah. Dee always imagined he would rise from whatever seat he held and break the nearest thing, that the old wildfire temper would leap where the wine had kept it banked. Instead, there was a cleanliness to the space inside him, the way the morning is clean before the first cart has thrown up dust. He considered that emptiness and found it preferable to many other things he had felt. "Say it again," Robert said, not because he had not heard, but because repetition made it become a structure on which one could lean. "They are not yours," Ned said, and there was pity in it that Robert did not want and did not despise. "Whose?" Robert asked, although of course he knew. We all read the same books, he thought, neatly bound, heavy with pedigree, the ink watching us with its polite, implacable little eyes. Ned spoke of hair and eyes, of the relentless march of certain traits, of the book into which generations had been copied like beeswax melts into a mold. He spoke of bastards in brothels with coal-black hair who could have been carved from the same block of wood. He spoke the name that had been waiting patiently in the room since this began. Jaime Lannister. "Cersei confessed it to me herself," Ned said at last, and at that a tremor did pass through the king, a bass note under the sternum. "Not in shame, not in anything I would recognize, in defiance. If you had died in the woods, the boy would have taken the throne while the blood was still drying, and she would have ruled through him. I think the wine on the hunt was no accident." Robert's fists clenched as if they meant to be hammers. The ache behind his eyes became a pulse that wanted language, a word older than oaths. He let his gaze drift to the window and from there out to the city, to the water holding the light. "And you," he said, "you came to me with this now, while I am stitched together like a sail while I—" Ned nodded once. "There was no other time." Robert exhaled. "Bring me the book." Ned looked relieved. He had expected the shout, the joke that became a blow. He clambered to his feet, careful with the leg, and limped to the small table by the hearth where a hefty volume lay like a pious rock. He set it on the bed with reverence and annoyance, as one sets down something that has lately saved your life and done so in a sanctimonious manner. They turned the pages, name after name, pair after pair, the same small facts, what color of hair, what shade of eye, the steadiness of men who had never imagined their notation would be a knife pressed to a queen. Robert read the names as if pronouncing them might conjure boys with dark curls and girls with black lashes, all the children he had not had with the woman who had slept in his bed. "Enough," he said finally, and shut the book. It smelled of glue and dust and the oil of many hands. He put his palm on its worn leather and found he was breathing evenly. "She will be brought to answer for this." Ned held his gaze, and something passed between them that was not approval or warning, but a long companionship flexing its memory. "We should do it with care," he said. Robert barked a dry laugh. "Care? Yes. The very thing I have always been known for." He stopped laughing. "You will be with me, Baratheon too, and Renly." He paused a beat. "Send for Varys and Pycelle and that other one with the little mouth and the little fingers. You shouldn't announce your course until you act," Ned said. The city likes to talk to itself. What it says can become true if given the afternoon. I will not whisper my way through this, Robert said. I have had enough of corridors and the things that grow in them. Then move fast, Ned said, before the corridors have time to move around you. Robert shifted and held the book out to Ned. Take this. If I hurl it at anyone, it will be because I want him dead, and this is too good a weapon for a fool's death. I'll keep it, Ned said. He tucked the weighty fact against his ribs like a shield and rose. When the door opened, the morning's politeness fled. Sound leapt into the chamber. The sudden clank of a bucket, the brisk clatter of a guard adjusting a pauldron, the voices of men about to have orders to carry, eager already for the shape of their day. Robert swung his legs over the side of the bed. He stood with care and then with less care. It hurt, and there was nothing to be done about that. He tolerated the hands that came to dress him because he must, and he endured Pycelle's sighs when the old man arrived, and he kept his words to the measure of necessity, because his temper wanted to run, and he would not let it run without him on its back. They made a slow caravan down the corridor, Robert and Ned and Baratheon like a pale tower beside them, Renly winging the party with the air of a man whose beauty had never yet been punished, Pycelle puffing, Varys floating silent with the sound of his slippers swallowed by the rugs, and Peter Baelish gliding with eyes that had the metallic sheen of coins in deep water. Robert looked at each of them and found in himself a hard, simple thing, like the head of a nail. It had always been there. He had hammered a kingdom together with it once and then had let the hammer sit where he dropped it. The queen waited in her solar with the morning sun polishing her hair to lacquer. She rose as they entered, and for a heartbeat, if a man were kind, he could think she had stood out of respect. Her face arranged itself with the exquisite control of someone who had been told all her life that the way she smiled could be a declaration of war or peace. Joffrey sat off to the side with one leg thrown over the arm of a chair. Myrcella, quiet and watchful, had a small embroidery frame in her lap with the thread forgotten midway through a flower. Tommen cradled a cat that purred as if it had never known court. Jaime Lannister was not there. Robert noticed the absence the way a hunter notices a change in wind. "You're Grak." Cersei said. The grace in question did not belong to him. Robert did not move to the chair they had put ready for him. He remained standing and let the ache in his middle become another sort of brace. The room's handsome arrangement of tapestries and vine-painted cabinets seemed smaller than it had ever seemed before, as if the air had conspired with the furniture to crowd them all together for what came next. He thought, briefly, absurdly, of how much she had cared about the placement of a vase last spring, the way she had moved it an inch, then another, until it was positioned as if all the room's balance depended on it. Perhaps it had. "You will come with us," he said to her, his voice even. "You are to be questioned in the throne room. Dress for a queen." Cersei looked at him almost kindly. It was a look you might give a man who had walked a long way and arrived without the thing he meant to carry. "About what?" she asked. Robert tipped his head very slightly toward Joffrey, as if the boy were a table that needed adjusting. "About the boy, and the men who made him." Silence fell, not the silence of astonishment. A thinner, sharper silence like silk cut across. Joffrey made a small scoffing sound through his nose. The cat purred louder and Tommen buried his face in its fur. Cersei's eyes did not flick to anyone else in the room, a feat of discipline that impressed the king against his will. She regarded him for 3 beats of her heart and then laughed, a single quiet note that had no mirth in it. "You finally found your book, then?" He did not give her the satisfaction of surprise. "Dress," he repeated. She did not move. "This is an insult," she said almost lazily. "To me, to my house, to your own children." Robert felt the first real heat in himself then. He directed it carefully. "Dress," he said to her a 3rd time, "or be carried as you are." For a fraction of a moment something inside her wavered, as a candle wavers in a draft, and then it became hard again. She turned to Myrcella and set a hand on the girl's shoulder, and the gesture was so gentle it broke something in Robert he had not known was unbroken. "I will return," she told the child. She did not look at Joffrey. She did not look at the king. She moved past Baratheon, past the tall, silent Lord Commander whose face was a carved white caution, and vanished into her chamber. When she returned, she wore a gown the green of wet leaves and a necklace of gold discs that lay on her throat like small suns. She had draped herself in victory to walk to a gallows. The procession to the throne room had the shape of ceremony but none of its joy. Servants gathered like shrubbery to watch as they passed. The hound stood nodding to no one in particular by a window, a vast patience in his shoulders, as if he had known this hour would come and had been waiting quietly with his great burnt brow for it to arrive. He fell in behind them as they went, the way a large animal falls in step with a movement that is already decided. In the throne room, the Iron Throne sat with its usual ugly languor, metal crawling over itself like a nest of swords transforming into a single monstrous thing. Robert hated it like a man hates the knife he is forced to carry in peacetime. A thing with a purpose but no love. He did not take it, but stood before it, swollen with stitches and purpose. The room filled and filled. The small council arranged themselves like an arrangement one never quite gets right. The pattern that makes a pleasing shape one day and looks wrong the next. The court twined around itself, scent and silk and ambition. Guards made their rhythm against the floor. Outside, bells spoke time to the city. They called witnesses. Robert let Ned steer the procession of names because Ned had the sobriety of a man accustomed to the scaffolding of truth. A wizened armorer who kept boys at his forge spoke in a voice that creaked like old leather of a dark-haired lad with eyes that could have been stamped from the king's own face. A lad whose mother had been paid to close her mouth. A steward with shaking hands retold a conversation half overheard in which a queen's cousin had fretted about a wine cask of unusually robust strength prepared for the king's hunt. The steward had thought it a small matter at the time, the way one thinks the wind will not shift a ship. Lancel Lannister was fetched, pale and unready, and under the weight of the room's stare and the king's attention. He admitted he had been generous with the wine and had done as he had been told, and had never thought to ask why. Pycelle wept a little in indignation at this impugning of a royal lady's prudence, and then wept a little because he thought weeping would look like wisdom. Varys folded his hands and when asked a thing gave back a thing that looked like an answer and was, in fact, an invitation to think of the answer you preferred. Peter Baelish smiled the smile he used for profitable boredom and modestly volunteered that he had once known a boy with dark hair in a brothel who had broken a girl's heart simply by looking like himself. Robert kept his voice level. He did not turn his head toward Joffrey even when the boy made movements in his chair that suggested either a cat under the cushion or the wish to be one. Myrcella had ceased even to pretend to stitch, the linen lying in her lap like a white flag. Tommen had gone to sleep with his cheek on the cat and drooled a little. The city, when the doors opened to admit someone late to the spectacle, smelt of fish and damp and the complicated sweetness of rotting fruit. Cersei stood as if her spine were a crown all by itself. When called upon, she did not so much answer as reread the question aloud with changes that made it a different question. She said the king was in his cups, the king was a man of appetites, the king had bastards everywhere, and so what was the point of a book that noticed everything except the truth, which was that the royal house you slept beside in the dark belonged to you and not to anyone's ink. She said many things with the economy of a woman who would have been excellent at running a small kingdom that did not contain men with swords. Ned said his own piece, and then looked at the king as if asking him to find himself. Robert felt again that cool, clear space inside him, the way air feels in a church at dawn. He did not look at the throne. He looked at Cersei. He thought, as he had not allowed himself to think in years, of Lyanna Stark and the smell of crushed winter leaves, the way grief had made his ribs into a cage where a hawk lived. He thought of his quiet shame, that he had married one woman and slept next to another woman's ghost, and that he had never once asked himself if the first could do anything but hate him for it. He thought of all the things he had not done because it was easier to drink and jest and pretend that the world would remain young if he refused to know it otherwise. "This is treason," he said, softly enough that those near had to lean forward and those far strained to hear. "Not to me, to the crown. The crown is not me. The crown is what we all pretend we deserve. Treason against that." The murmur in the throne room subsided like a wind passing over barley. The guards knew the moment when words became orders and readied themselves for it. Cersei breathed in and out through her nose and said, very almost gently, "Then do it. You have a talent for doing what another man has already begun." It was a clean thrust under the ribs. Robert took it without the stagger she had expected. "You're not wrong," he said, "but I have not always taken great joy in finishing what other men began. I have wondered often what it would be to begin something myself and see it tended like a fire rather than doused with wine." He paused and let the room understand that he could speak so, and do the other thing too. Cerilin. The king's justice stepped forward as if he had been dozing only to the summons all his life. No emotion lived on his flat, moonless face. The great sword on his back looked like an argument against softness. Joffrey rose then, his face brilliant with shock or outrage or a parody of either. "You cannot. She is the queen." "I am." Robert turned then and put a single finger out. The movement was small, but the air around it crisped, the way air does near lightning. "You are a boy," he said, not unkindly, and in the long plummet of those syllables there was a mercy as well as a sentence. "Sit." Joffrey sat. He was white and trembling, and for the first time since he had learned there were people who existed only to do what he asked, he seemed to realize that there might also be people who would do what someone else asked while he watched. Cersei smiled then, a terrible, small thing that looked like the breaking of a fine wire. "You will be remembered for this," she said. "I would rather be remembered for other things," the king said. He looked to Baratheon. "You will see to the children's safety. They are not to be harmed in any way, not one hair. They will be held as wards of the crown until arrangements can be made. The boy," he would not say the name, not now, "is to be confined to his rooms with guard. He is not to be mocked. He is not to be visited by those who would whisper into his ear. If any man strikes him, I will have the hand that did it put on a spike. Do you understand me?" "I do," Baratheon said. His voice had the steadiness of a man who has loved the law longer than he has loved his own comfort. Cersei did not plead. She did not try to run. She did not say the names of her children aloud to wound the air. She stood very tall, and when she walked, it was with the same precise grace she had used when crossing a hall to sit at a too long table. She made even that look like a victory. They did not make a spectacle of it in the square. Robert refused the theater of a crowd's howl. The courtyard in the Red Keep where they took her instead had sky and pigeons and one olive tree planted when Maegor had been as angry as any man had ever been. The sun had risen fully to its day by then, light laying the stones bare the way truth lays men bare. There were perhaps 50 people, no more. Word would go out and others would say they had seen it, and the thing seen would be worse or more beautiful depending on the mouth that spoke it. Let it be so. The truth did not beg for company. She knelt without being told. Ser Island's sword drew its straight line across the day. Robert found himself saying her name once, as if names could return us all to a beginning where we had not yet chosen. She did not turn her head. He had not expected her to. When it was done, there was no sound for long enough it became a presence. The pigeons startled at last and clattered into the sky. Varys wept a tear at the corner of one eye and then spent a long moment examining his fingers. Peter's gaze was on the olive leaves, as if calculating the yield of oil. Pycelle looked faint, then decided not to be. Renly was already speaking softly to a guard. He had plans in the pocket of his smile. Robert breathed in and out until the breath became something he recognized. The ache behind his eyes had hardened into a narrow ridge. He let it be. He raised one hand and Baratheon stepped forward and began doing what had to be done. The sorting of people, the naming of rooms and guards, the long stringing of scents along the day. He did not return to his bedchamber. He went instead to the high parapet that looked out toward the sea. The wind off the bay was clean the way a cut is clean. He set his hands on the rough top of the wall and stood with his weight carefully distributed. He thought of the boy and the girl and the other boy, and felt nothing so much as a grief for which there was no suitable metaphor. He thought of Jaime Lannister, whose absence had sent small questions under dew, oars all morning, and felt what he had felt the day he had killed Rhaegar. The curtailed triumph of a task completed that changed nothing that needed changing. Ned found him there, The wind lifted the hair off Ned's temple and set it down again as if placing something where it belonged. "It is done," Ned said. He had never been a man to dress a fact in clothes it did not require. "It is done," Robert said. He kept his gaze on the water where sunlight broke in small, shattered paths. "Now everything that comes next comes faster." Ned stood with him for a while. Below them a ship was towed out into the current by a crew of men bent as one. "Tywin will answer," he said at last. "Tywin would have answered no matter what I did," Robert said. "The man's blood writes his correspondence for him." He turned and looked at Ned, the way a man searches the horizon and finds a cliff he knows. "We will send ravens. Send one to Dragonstone. Tell Stannis to come. He should have been here, but I understand him even when I do not like him. Send one to Storm's End. Tell Renly to ready the garrison and to stop smiling at people who cannot do him harm. Send one to Winterfell." He paused then, a half-grin cutting his face for the first time that day. "Not because I think your wife wishes to hear from me, but because I owe her the courtesy of telling her the world has shifted under her feet again." "I will send them," Ned said. He hesitated. "And what of Jaime Lannister?" "What of him?" Robert said. "Find him. If he is in the city, he will be found. If he is not, he will be where gold is and where gold breeds arrogance."
Ned nodded.
"He will run to his father's shadow." Robert's mouth twisted. "He has lived there all his life. Some men like that particular shade." "He once left a very different shadow," Ned said. "On a certain day in a certain hall." Robert snorted. "Yes, he did, and we have been paying since." He rubbed a hand across his face. The stubble rasped. "Do you ever think, Ned, of how many decisions we have all made because we feared to look at the thing we already knew?" Ned's eyes were gray as old iron.
"Ido."
Robert turned back to the sea, letting the wind work across his skin. He could feel where the stitches pulled slightly, the tugging of thread through meat. He did not resent the thread as he had earlier. He felt complicatedly grateful. "I need to say something to the court," he said. "Not a speech. I am poor at speeches. But something that sets the shape of what we are doing before it starts doing us." "Say it to me," Ned said. "I'll tell you what in it will sound like a promise you cannot keep." Robert's grin returned, a smaller thing, truer for being so reduced. "I will say this, that the crown is not a toy for one house's delight, that my brothers are my line of succession, Stannis after me, then Renly, that I will not name one of my bastards heir and make a habit of my vices into law, that the law will hold, and that the children who have slept in my palace will sleep safe tonight." "It will anger men," Ned said. "And if I said nothing, it would anger men," Ned allowed, and there was a sliver of something like relief in his voice. "This is better. Truth makes a better enemy than rumor." They left the parapet and the wind's clean taste. The day began to spool out with the inexorability of a rope thrown down a well. Once, Robert had enjoyed this, the sensation of command that meant things existed because he had named them. He found it now to be both thinner and more necessary than it had ever been. He spoke briefly in the hall at midday, and his voice did not crack, and he found that he meant the words even as he suspected they would be used against him. The court listened. Some took sober notes in their minds. Others admired a sleeve. Littlefinger's attention was immaculate and deceptive, like all good attention. Varys's gaze drifted beyond the king as if startled by a bird no one else could see. Renly was radiant and bored. Pycelle arranged his chain so it shone just so in the light and nodded when nodding was appropriate. Ser Barristan's armor had the careful gleam of a mirror polished by a careful man. In the afternoon, messengers left the city like threads being sewn outward. A raven for Dragonstone and the man who lived there with his austerities. A raven for Storm's End and the brother who refused to learn to be frightened by his smiles. A raven for the Rock because some courtesies are knives wrapped in silk. Quiet riders with folded parchments for the Reach and the Riverlands and the Vale, with language crafted to be both firm and not insulting. It takes as much labor to cause no offense as it does to bake a fine loaf of bread. The kitchens were full of heat and dough and clatter, The rookery was full of wings and the small thunder of feet on stone stairs. The stables were a low choir of horses who knew they would be running soon. Ned went to his daughters. Sansa sat like the painting of a saint one would put above a hearth to coax good behavior out of children. Hands folded in her lap, her eyes dry. Arya had a small nick on her knuckle from some unadvised practice with something not meant to be a sword. Ned loved them both so fiercely he thought for a moment that the love had heat you could measure with a hand over it. He sat and told them the truth in the measure he thought they could bear, and then a little more than that because the world would not measure its truths to them kindly. Sansa said, very composed, that she had always been promised to a prince. Arya said a thing about princes that made Ned frown and smile at once. He told them that whatever was promised must sometimes be unpromised when the premise on which the promise had been made had been found hollow. Sansa's chin lifted in a way that reminded him of Catelyn when she counted money. Arya frowned as if trying to set a broken bone. Sansa asked if the prince would be punished. Ned said he was a boy, and the truest punishment boys receive is the one in which they are put into rooms with themselves and told to live there. Arya asked if she could go look at the city from the very highest place. Ned said she could do so if she took 2 guards and did not make the guards hate their lives. Arya scowled and then dipped her chin in a nod. She shot out of the room like a hiccup of wind. Sansa remained seated, and when Ned got up to go she put a hand out and caught his sleeve and said, very quietly, that she was not sure how to feel, and that what she was most certain of was that she did not want anyone to see her trying to be certain. He kissed the top of her head. He had learned to be grateful for the ordinary shape of a daughter's skull under his lips. He had learned to be grateful for small things because occasionally they were the only things that were. Jaime Lannister was found at dusk. They did not find him with a blade in his hand or a lady in his lap. They found him in the September of Baelor, standing beneath a depiction of a god whose eyes had been made too large for the face of his marble, so that mercy looked accidental. He had come with 2 cloaked men and had sent them away, and he had stood alone long enough that the Septon had become nervous in the way men do when someone famous does not behave the way he is supposed to. When the guards approached, Jaime smiled at them as one smiles at a group of puppies who have mistaken themselves for wolves. He came quietly as a favor to himself, not to them. They took his sword. He tilted his hand as the weight left it in a gesture that might have been regret or might have been impatience with gravity. He was brought through the streets at an hour when the work of the day had ended but the talk about the day's work had not, and so many saw him. Some shouted things because that is what a crowd's mouth does. Some watched with the silence of people adding and subtracting with their hearts and fearful of what the sum would be. They brought him before the king after the day was too tired to stand. The throne room had stripped itself down to bone by then. No silk of courtiers, no soft cough of careful men. Barristan, Varys, Pycelle, Littlefinger, a pair of guards backlit by torchlight. Ned with the day on his shoulders. Jaime inclined his head to the king the exact fraction necessary to acknowledge the existence of a hierarchy without encouraging it. You left your post, Robert said. Jaime glanced down at his chest, as if a post might be pinned there. My post left me, your grace. You broke your oath, Ned said. He stepped forward into the light that did nothing to his face. Which one? Jaime asked. He smiled down at his wrists where the rope nodded. They breed. You make them and then you make another to contradict the first. And men like me have to carry them like sacks full of stones and pretend to be grateful for the exercise. Robert approached him slowly. You made a boy with your sister and called him my son. I made 3, Jaime said. He lifted his gaze to the king's and Robert saw that the man's face could darken when told his own truth back to him without apology. I called them mine. Others did the calling that suited them. I never cared whose mouth said which thing. You have always been better with mouths than I. Robert's hand twitched. He caught it with the other hand and kept them both where he had put them. She is dead, he said. Jaime's Adam's apple moved once, an undignified leap. He lowered his head briefly and the hair fell forward, and there was a handsome boy's ghost there then, and he brushed it aside and smiled again. By your order. By mine, Robert said. Jaime considered the ground. Well, he said, we each keep our habits. Ned moved as if to speak and then did not. The torchlight made hollows under his cheekbones as if his face had been carved that afternoon by an impatient hand. "What will you do with me?" Jaime asked, and had the insolence to look bored. Robert regarded him. He thought of Tywin Lannister's eyes, which he had seen twice in his life. They had not been warm either time. "For now," the king said, "you will live. You will be a prisoner who is treated like a knight until you have cause to remember that you are not a knight but a man on whom the law has a claim. You will be guarded and fed. You will not write letters. You will not whisper. If you ask for a book, I will give you a boring one." Jaime's smile sharpened. "All books are boring when one reads them for penance." "I will send one without pictures," Robert said, and was surprised at himself for the laugh that escaped him then. It sounded like a cough that had decided to be amused. After, alone with Ned, he set both palms on the table and pressed until the grain pronounced itself into his skin. "If Tywin marches," he said, "I will meet him. I am tired, Ned, but not so tired I cannot remind that man that a crown is not a thing he can grind into a sword hilt." "He will not write long letters," Ned said. "He will write with men. He will begin by gathering them as if holding grain in two hands." Robert nodded. The scowl on his face in that moment could have written its own laws. "And the boy? Joffrey will rage, and then he will sulk, and then he will wonder what he is. And that is the worst question any of us ever has to ask," Ned said. He rubbed his leg absently. It had been a day shaped like a mountain. Climbing it had left him numb. "Have you ever wondered what you are?" Robert asked. It was not mockery. It might have been an invitation. Ned's mouth moved and then stilled. After a space he said, "I am someone trying to keep things from becoming worse." Robert grunted. "A noble trade." He pushed himself away from the table and winced, and then did not allow himself to wince again. "Tomorrow we will speak again to the city. Just enough to keep them from inventing something better. The day after that," he stopped. Addition. The day after that had a habit of refusing to be the thing you had named it. They parted. Ned carried the book with him back to his chambers, the heavy book of names that had saved them and ended an age. He set it on his table and put his hand on it for a long time, not because he loved books but because he respected things that told the truth even when telling the truth broke them. He stood at the window and watched the city burn small lamps like small hopes. In the next room his daughters breathed through sleep and he counted their breaths until he could count nothing. Robert returned not to his bed but to the chair near the window where one could see the black shape of the bay in the moonlight. He poured wine and did not drink it for a while. He set it on the table and let its red stand there like a minor god. He thought of Lyanna. He thought of Cersei. He tried and failed to think of them together. He closed his eyes and saw neither. He saw instead the boar's black eye, calm and indifferent. He laughed like a man who has remembered a stupid joke, and then did not laugh again. Someone coughed outside the door, and he said without rising, "Enter." Varys drifted in, a robe gathering the light to itself as if by choice. He bowed as if his spine were a spring he had chosen to uncoil. "You've been busy," Robert said. "I have been precisely as busy as you have required me to be, Your Grace," Varys said, and showed his hands like a conjurer proving he held no knives. "I come to bring you what I have and to ask you what you want that I do not yet have." "If I told you what I want," Robert said, "you would tell me a story about wanting." Varys smiled. "I might, or I might tell you how the city will speak of today, because the way it speaks of a thing often becomes the thing." "Speak," Robert said. He reached for the wine, then withdrew his hand. "The tale is already bifurcated," Varys said with pleasure in his mouth, that pleasure men take when describing a knife. "There is one version in which a wronged king has set his house in order, and another in which a drunken usurper has struck down a proud lady to humiliate her house and weaken a realm. The one will be told in kitchens that hate their lords, and the other in halls that hate their king. Both will be embroidered by women and by men who wish to be seen as women by other men." "Where will Tywin put his needle?" Robert asked. "In the second story," Varys said. He will stitch until the garment fits even those who do not wish to wear it. Robert's laugh was sandpaper. And little finger? Varys's face rearranged itself into neutrality, as if his features could be called to formation. He will stitch both garments, and wear whichever whispers louder in the right ear on the right day. Robert lifted the wine and finally drank. It was a good red, and it tasted of summer stone, of a heat that had chosen to be generous. He set it down with a gentleness that surprised him. "And you, Spider? I mended a hole in the city today," Varys said. "One you did not know was there. When the queen fell, there was a vacuum, and in a vacuum men place words like stones. I have placed a few of my own. They will keep some men from falling into the hole while they look for you to tell them what comes next." Robert looked out the window at the bay, at the way the moon drew a road across the water that no one could walk. "What comes next?" he said. He tasted it like a coin. When Varys left, the room felt as if something soft had been taken away and something harder had been left in its place. Robert drank again, and then empty-handed he sat and listened to the city confide in itself through the walls. He thought of war, and he found he did not dread it the way he had dreaded mornings these past few years. This thought did not make him proud. Night found the Red Keep, moved through its rooms and apartments on small feet. Jaime Lannister lay on his back staring at a ceiling with a crack he could map already with his eyes closed, thinking of a girl he had kissed for the first time in a tower with dawn at the window. Myrcella sat between two quiet ladies who told her unimportant stories, and she held her small hands so still in her lap it hurt to look at them. Tommen slept with a thumb tucked in his mouth until Margot the cat batted it away, bored and affectionate. Joffrey paced the length of his chamber and back, and then he stood at the window and looked down and saw nothing that looked like him, and he did not cry. Peter Baelish returned to his pleasant house off the Street of Silk and counted coins in his mind until they turned into favors, which he liked more. Varys sat and wrote 3 letters in a hand that looked like a woman's and made 3 arrangements a queen would have admired. Pycelle slept with his mouth open and dreamt of a lecture he had once given in which his students had loved him and been many. Renly smiled at the ceiling the way men do when they are rehearsing something they will say tomorrow to someone who does not yet know they are about to be persuaded. Ned Stark remained awake longer than was good for him. He turned the pages of the book once and then closed it again, not because he feared what was in it, but because he respected rest for the dead facts as one respects rest for horses. He thought of Catelyn and her anger and her steady kindness, of Bran's quickness and Robb's carefulness, of the smallness of Rickon's hand, of Jon's quiet. He thought of the way the North had its own silence that this city could not drown even if it tried. Far to the west, a raven came to Casterly Rock and found a man awake already, a desk lamp making a small island of light in a large room. Tywin Lannister broke the seal and read slowly, and then read again more quickly and found after the second reading that his jaw had set itself. He did not swear. He did not throw anything. He did not, in fact, move for a long moment. Then he lifted a small bee. L and rang it, and the sound made neat little circles in the air that collapsed into obedience. At dawn, the Red Keep stones found the city again, as if it had gone somewhere in the night and returned. The kitchens boiled porridge. The training yard barked cold, bright orders. Scribes ate bread and dipped pens. The day was a block of wood ready for carving. The first cut would decide the shape of the statue, and kings and carvers alike knew there is no returning a shaving once it is on the floor. Robert dressed without Pycelle's supervision. He took a long breath and the stitches tugged politely, reminding him of their good work. When he walked into the hall to break his fast, conversations broke and then resumed because the world must go on lubricated by words. He ate without tasting. He looked at the men around him and thought not of their names but of what they had chosen yesterday. It is a useful sort of accounting. He called for Barristan. "The children," he said. "You will take the girl to the man whose house is green and wealthy and whose caution is greater than his pride. She will be safe there and will be used as a way to talk to me. Good. Let them use her so that I can use their use. The younger boy goes to Storm's End. He is gentle. Renly will spoil him and perhaps he will learn that kindness is less expensive than power. The other boy stays under guard and under silence. He will not be bait for anyone's anger. He belongs to me now because I took his mother. That is the logic of the world, and I will not evade it." Baratheon bowed. "As you command." "And the King's Guard?" Robert asked. "They have sworn," Baratheon said. "Those who wish to unswear have learned that words are easier to say than lives are to turn." "Keep them close," Robert said. "Men with oaths are like men with swords. Useful, dangerous, necessary. Employed badly, they cut their masters before their enemies." After breakfast, he walked the long corridor to the small chapel that smelled of wax and herbs. He had never liked chapels. He preferred trees if he was to speak to anything not himself. But there was a comfort in benches that had borne more weight than he could lift. He sat and balanced his forearms on his thighs and let his head hang for a moment. The quiet crept across the floor and climbed the pews and came to sit beside him, large and companionable. He did not pray. He talked. He talked to Lyanna and to no one and to himself. He said, in so many ways that surprised him with their simplicity, that he was sorry. He did not enumerate for what. A man knows the ledger of his own apologies better than anyone else will ever know it. He said the one thing men say when they have taken a thing away and cannot return it. He said he would try. When he left the chapel, the first of the replies from his letters were waiting like different weather at the doors. From Dragonstone came a neat, spare hand. "I will come." Stannis's words had always been like the man's posture, straight to the point where argument has to curve to go around him. He said he would bring ships and a tongue that did not flatter. That was good. There is power in a brother who will tell you what you do not wish to hear, and there is danger too. From Storm's End came a flourishing, affectionate laugh on a page. "Of course. I am packing clothes and vanity and one or two men who are good at dying where they will be seen." Renly wrote as if this were a tournament, which for him it often was. From Casterly Rock came nothing yet. Silence from the west has its own sound. Robert stood with the parchment in his hand and found his heart beat steadier. He looked toward the water, as if tempted to walk its broken road. He turned instead and walked to meet his choices. The day was clear. The day would darken. There would be feasts and sieges and the peculiar labor of the making of law and the managing of children and the moving of men like pieces on a board that had been in play too long. There would be conversations in corners that would rot fruit faster than the heat. There would be a boy who had thought he knew what he was and would spend long years under a ceiling that would teach him otherwise. There would be a girl sent to a garden to learn that perfume can disguise poison and cannot disguise it forever. There would be a gentle boy whose heart would bruise easily in marble halls and might, if he were lucky, become a strong thing not by learning to harden but by learning that softness can be a blade. Robert moved through his palace and the city breathed in time with him. He had claimed the morning. The afternoon would try to claim him. He thought, adjusting his belt where it dug at the stitches, that pain had many proper uses, and one of them was to remind a man he was still here. He went to find Ned. The two of them stood by a window that gave them the sight of the Street of Steel, where boys learned to keep a blade in a straight line and men argued about the quality of edge on an axe. They did not speak for a while. The city's noise climbed the stone and found them and laid itself at their feet like a dog that had walked very far and wanted, for a moment, to rest where it could trust the hands it lay near. "You should rest," Ned said eventually. "I will rest when I cannot stand," Robert replied. "That has been my habit, and I am loath to improve it." Ned's smile was thin as a leaf. "We have done a hard thing. We have done an unavoidable thing," Robert said. "The hard things are the ones we could have chosen not to do." Ned looked out at the street. A smith's hammer kept time with their silence. "We should go home," he said very low, as if speaking to himself surprised him. "We do not have homes," Robert said, not unkindly. "We have places that tolerate our sleep." Ned nodded as if this were fair, which it was, and unfair, which it was also. He straightened. "I'll see to the guard rotations for the prince." "The boy." "Good, Rob," Yarty said. He put his hand on the sill and felt the coolness travel up his arm.
Ned.
"When the letter comes from Tywin, bring it to me yourself. I will not have anyone else's breath on its fold. "It will not be a letter," Ned said. "Then bring me the man," Robert said. He smiled without humor. "Or let him bring himself. I will meet him at the gate like a neighbor and we will talk of fences." By afternoon, the first rumor fabric had been woven and was being worn. In the market, a fishwife said the queen had ascended into the air like a wisp of silk, and another fishwife said she had been buried under the floor. A sellsword swore he'd seen the king weep, and a boy said he had seen the king laugh, and both were not precisely untrue. A man who had never had the leisure to think of such matters before held his cup a little longer in his hand and wondered if the world had a seam he had never noticed because his hands were always full of other things. In the black cells, a rat washed its face as if to reassure itself that it still had one. In the rookery, a bird with a bald, disreputable head pecked at a grain of something it did not recognize and decided to eat it anyway. In the street of silk, a girl threaded a needle with a steady hand and began to stitch a flower she did not like because the man paying for it did. On the parapet where the wind had been clean, a small boy with two large eyes looked up at the sky and told a guard a story about a dragon that never learned to fly because it was afraid, and the guard surprised himself by asking what became of the dragon then. The boy said it learned to walk instead, and found the earth as it had been meant to. The guard said that was a silly story, and then decided perhaps it was not. The day lengthened like a bow being drawn back. It would release, and the arrow of the night would go somewhere none of them could name and all of them could guess. Robert stood with one foot braced on the future and one on the past and found that what held him up was not the crown but the stubborn muscle of a friendship that had not given way under the weight it had been made to bear. When the moment came, as it always does, when the light decides to go and the darkness decides to come, a raven beat at the air over the bay with wings that looked too small for the work. It came across the water and found the tower that had been built to receive such work, and it perched and was taken, and its message was tied and untied by hands that had ink under their nails. The man who read it did so with the resignation of someone who had lived his life between the before and the after of someone else's choice. The message went to the king, who read it without sitting down. It did not demand. It did not plead. It was very nearly courteous in its listing of names and wrongs and the weight of a house. It said a host would be gathered. It said righteousness would ride at its head. It said father and it said son and did not say sister. Robert folded it, and his hands made a hard, small noise against the paper. He lifted his head and the lamplight made a faint crown of the seam where his hair met his brow. He looked like a man who remembered the road a march takes. He looked like a man who at last had found again his old hammer and had decided to pick it up, not to smash a thing because it had displeased him, but to build a beam because the roof was sagging. He went to find Ned. He went moving like a man who had learned that slow is sometimes stronger than fast. In the corridor, a guard bowed with that deep surprise respect men have after a day that has tried to teach them something about the world and may have succeeded. The castle breathed around him, stone cooling, secrets rebraiding themselves for the sleep from which they would rise in the morning to be worn like hair. He found Ned by the same window, as if friendship were a place one can return to by habit. He held out the paper and Ned read it and did not sigh, because sighs are for grief and this was not grief yet. It was intention. Robert said nothing for a long time. He could hear the night rubbing itself against the city. He could hear his own heart old as a drum. "We will meet him," he said at last. "We will meet him and the law between us and see which of us respects it more by the end." Ned nodded slowly, and beside the nod was the ghost of a man younger than either of them who had once wanted to write his name on the world with a sword. "We will," he said. They stood together. The world stood also, like a creature poised to leap in whatever direction the next breath would press it. The night, when it came finally down from the sky and settled on their shoulders, did not feel like an ending. It felt like something coiling itself to be ready. The pause in the lungs before the shout, the held silence between a verdict and the lowering of a sword, the long moment in the hunt when the boar has not yet entered the clearing and the men have not yet chosen whether they will stand their ground.